Well, the introductions were so good. I think I should quit while I'm ahead. But thank you. I thank JWI for the award. It's stunning, it's lovely. And I'm truly honored to be here to receive this award. I'm grateful for all the very kind things that have been said, although I always worry a little bit when former clerks introduce me, because like Lord Balfour, I can usually shrug off being criticized, and I'm okay with being praised or abused, but I have moments of uneasiness when being explained. But I'm very grateful for your presence here. When Hadley first suggested this idea, I felt considerable trepidation. I always do. I have held in my heart Adam Smith's caution that one should never seek praise, only try to live a life that's praiseworthy. I think there's a Catholic prayer of humility that says something very similar. In a lot fewer words. And let's face it, when it comes to my modest mission of saving America, I have been a spectacular failure. In my old age, though, I've learned some things about failing. It's a subject that I will return to in a moment. But my bargain with JWI was, okay, I will do this, but only if it's a family dinner. Because it's okay to admit your failures to your family. So I hope you will bear with me. The Constitution has been at the center of my professional life for well over 3 decades. I have made every effort to remain faithful to its meaning. But when I survey recent results, I cannot help but think that my best efforts have effectuated very little good. I have done very little, but I've tried to do as much as I could. And I've said this before, my feeling about an award for a judge stands much like the grave marker that Bret Hart is said to have encountered in Boot Hill Cemetery, Arizona. It said, "Johnson, he done his damnedest." So I thought, that's probably a pretty decent epithet. Not bad, really. But the way things are going doesn't feel particularly good. Barely a month ago, a federal judge was shouted down, hectored, and lectured, and denied the opportunity to speak at Stanford, one of our premier law schools. The administrator who behaved so discourteously was temporarily suspended, but when another administrator apologized to the judge, she had to walk through a gauntlet of jeering black masked protesters to reach her classroom, a sort of walk of shame just for being courteous to someone who was invited to that law school. A few days later, Charlie Kirk's attempt to speak at the University of California at Davis to a registered chapter of Turning Point USA, an organization he founded, was possible only after a phalanx of police quelled an Antifa mob that broke windows, vandalized university property, threw eggs, and used pepper spray on people attending the event. Before Kirk even arrived, the UC Davis chancellor, Gary May, aired a video expressing sympathy with students who objected to Kirk's invitation to speak. Blaming the TPUSA student group for hosting Kirk, and described him as a, quote, well-documented proponent of misinformation and hate who has advocated for violence against transgender individuals. The local newspaper, the Sacramento Bee, which I used to receive, echoed these claims. Although to date no evidence has been produced to support any of this, and oddly enough, the chancellor has not acknowledged that by falsely accusing Charlie Clerk of misinformation and hate, he actually did what he falsely accused Kirk of doing. And he has not commented at all on Antifa's mob violence. At least the Sacramento Bee retracted these allegations and offered an apology. Just last year, Christian Wagner, who is the chief counsel for ADF, the Alliance Defending Freedom, was invited to participate in a Federalist Society program at Yale to discuss a nearly unanimous Supreme Court victory. The program was intended to demonstrate that a liberal atheist and a conservative Christian could find common ground on free speech issues. Ironically, protesters at the law school refused to allow them to speak. When the frustrated faculty moderator told the protesters to grow up, their response was a furious barrage of profanity and invective, pretty much what you would expect from a room full of 2-year-olds, except hopefully they would not have used that language. And by the way, this is precisely what opponents of campus speech codes predicted when such codes first became trendy. Afterwards, more than 400 Yale law students signed a letter complaining of the school's treatment of the protesters. The letter accused Yale of endangering the lives of the LGBTQ community because the police were called to restore order and because ADF is a hate group. And apparently, they are a hate group because Christian Wagner's argument that the Constitution protects a Christian man's right to proselytize threatens the well-being of the vulnerable LGBTQ community. So after several years of unprecedented political tumult, civil discourse has been replaced by riots and speakers intimidated and even assaulted by mobs. When public intellectuals as disparate as Christina Hoff Sommers, Ayaan Hirsi Ali, and Charles Murray are disinvited, deplatformed, or canceled, it is not because they are guilty of hate speech. However that is defined, they're being condemned as heretics for contradicting left-wing orthodoxy. It is the same reason students protest Heather McDonald's appearance and are taught to sneer at, quote, truth as a Euro-normative construct they need not pursue. Perhaps that is the reason post-truth was declared Oxford Dictionary's Word of the Year in 2016. Post-truth is an adjective defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than appeals to emotion and personal belief. And it is certainly the reason university professors can argue that speech that opposes the left-wing narrative is violence, and to respond with actual violence is merely self-defense. And when such bogus reasoners claim the moral high ground, it may be time, and perhaps past time, to think anew about the kind of polity, the character of political leadership, and the poetry of freedom required to sustain a community of free people. And this is where I think I sort of had an epiphany. But of course, at my age, it was maybe just a TIA. You'll have to judge for yourself. A few provide an anchor from which to resist the tides of nihilism that seem to be flowing through the judiciary. And admittedly, I saw a tougher, reinvigorated judiciary as a source of salvation. And I think a lot of people did. There have been a whole group of books that have talked about judicial fortitude and how if only judges would, could focus and do a better job, things would improve, and that would solve our problems. So I have to admit, I was sort of making that argument too, although I was arguing that writtenness might allow them to look at the telos of the Constitution. But I had not really focused on James Wilson's surprisingly coherent political theory and the way in which it illuminates the Constitution's focus on human flourishing. So I'm indebted to a scholar named James Zink for looking at Wilson and noting that he and most of the other statesmen of the founding era saw the fundamental nature of human beings as free and equal rights bearers as the organizing principle of politics. Government existed to secure natural rights and must be judged by how well they secured them. And so, quoting from Wilson, he says, "Government, in my humble opinion, should be formed to secure and enlarge the natural rights of its members, and every government which has not this in view as its principal object is not a government of the legitimate kind." Wilson clearly understood the radical implications of a natural rights regime, but he nevertheless insisted, man does not exist for the sake of government, but government is instituted for the sake of man. 100 years earlier, Sir Robert Filmer had basically described Hobbes' political theory as a prescription for anarchy, and the American revolutionaries were sometimes vilified and accused of wanting to unhinge and destroy every government on earth because they thought this idea of natural rights, this primacy of natural rights, was so radical. So Wilson acknowledged the tension, but he insisted the Constitution minimized that tension by cultivating within its citizens a refined understanding of the complex interdependence of liberty and law. And again, quoting from him, he says, "Without liberty, law loses its nature and its name and becomes oppression. Without law, liberty also loses its nature and its name and becomes licentiousness. Individuals who learn to love both liberty and law realize they gain far more liberty than they lose by submitting to law." That's, I think, a very optimistic view. I can't imagine that anybody now would articulate that sort of idea, because what we're told and what progressivism sort of delivered to us was, well, the ordinary non-birthing person, otherwise known as the common man, really isn't up to dealing with the Constitution. This is all too complex for them, right? And so I was really struck by that. I think he's saying this very seriously. Yes, they can understand it, and we should expect them to, and it's part of the job of the Constitution and the government to make sure that they are educated to be citizens, right? So I found it really striking, his optimism and his confidence in the perspicacity of ordinary people. And I find it particularly striking when it's contrasted with the snarky, dismissive, salvific pose of today's new aristocracy. But Wilson thought the Constitution offered a plain and accessible language which demystified for all who read it the correct principles of government. He was very concerned about what he saw as the political consequences of language. He says, "It is in consequence of language that we are united by political societies, government, and laws." The expansive size of the American Republic, which the anti-federalists thought was a real disadvantage. They basically argued, you can't do this with a country as big as America. You have to have a small, homogeneous society. But he said the expansive size of the American Republic and its natural rights political order would make self-government impossible unless citizens expand their perspective and learn to view their rights and interests within the broader context of the whole. He believed the written Constitution would play an integral role in fostering among citizens a sense of civic duty and an attachment to the public good, and minimizing the blind pursuit of self-interest. And it appears that Wilson's view that the writtenness of the Constitution could reinforce the security of individual rights was apparently widely shared by his contemporaries. In short, he exhibits a surprising degree of faith in the capacity of ordinary Americans to exercise their rights responsibly. Moreover, he believed the Constitution would, by weaving the Declaration's principle of liberty into the very fabric of government, not only help to shape and temper the exercise of rights, but model how to behave within a community of free people. Now, that actually is kind of extraordinary. He took the sovereign role of the people seriously. And when I think about it, I hadn't really focused on this. They really all did. The public ratifying conventions for the Constitution sought to involve the people directly in the process of approving and sanctifying the document, thereby educating them about its institutional features and granting them a stake in the outcome. In Wilson's home state of Pennsylvania, copies of the Constitution were produced in German for the benefit of that state's large German population. And Wilson himself went to that state convention to urge ratification. Another part of his political theory was what he called participation. He said the pride and sense of ownership citizens would derive from participation, especially the process of popular elections, would strengthen the social bond necessary for the political longevity of the nation. So, he presents actually through all of his lectures and his speeches this very comprehensive political theory. And that political theory reposes a lot of confidence in the people and their ability to understand. And in fact, there's a sense of magnanimity about what he's saying, that it requires something to be people in a free community, and that something requires a sort of great-heartedness, right? A willingness not to push your rights, to the utmost limit. And he felt that people were very capable of doing that. And I think that was not an aberration. If you look at, we get all the way down to Abraham Lincoln, he says the role of great political actors responding to urgent necessities is to look backward rather than forward. He's not a progressive, in other words. He says, as a nation of free men, we must live through all time or die by suicide. But forgetfulness is the greatest danger to our political institutions. The history that could once be read in the battle-scarred lives of our fathers, brothers, and sons, the pillars of the Temple of Liberty, had crumbled away. And he said that temple itself will fall unless succeeding generations replace the old revolutionary passion with civil reason molded into general intelligence, sound morality, and in particular, a reverence for the Constitution and laws. Well, I go through all of that because I think it's so remarkable if you contrast that with the conversation that we have now about the nature of our government. And this starts with the progressives and, their idea that, this whole idea of restraint, right? Self-restraint, as well as a limited government, was somehow the cause of all the problems. Whereas, the founders and people like James Wilson were saying, no, that's the answer, that's the solution. But I think it's very hard for us to think in those terms now. And once we get past, the Civil War and Lincoln's notion that this is a sacred legacy that we are obliged, to preserve, we really get into the progressive era and people who are, very contemptuous of ideas linked to traditional law and morality. Things like the law of nature and nature's God, and enthralled to totalitarian and secular ideologies and their premise of untrammeled power. And so I was thinking that, this of the progressive hostility to natural rights and natural law really sort of mimics the aversion that many scientists have to the idea of transcendence. It was the best analogy that I could think of the way, progressives rejected natural rights because a government limited to the protection of individual rights would constrain their vision of the government as a limitless authority. And it struck me, I remember reading something by Thomas Nagel, where he said, he was talking about why he's a materialist. And he said, it isn't just that I don't believe in God and naturally hope that I'm right in my belief. It's that I hope there is no God. I don't want there to be a God. I don't want the universe to be like that. And Richard Lewontin says something very similar. He says, scientists are willing to accept any kind of just so story because of their prior commitment to materialism. And because of that commitment, they cannot allow a divine foot in the door, right? So it's really what is happening is that our ability to rationalize what we want, what serves our will to power, if that's what we are all about, means that we sort of denigrate, we minimize the ability of ordinary people to deal with their own lives. We assume that they are not capable of doing that. So this I think is why we ended up where we are. And as Hadley was saying, a lot of this goes back to the 1930s because that's when the courts abandoned the defense of limited government. And you can actually trace this very, like from about, 1936 to 1942, all these cases are decided which basically unleash the Leviathan, right? And self-government, with its requirements for moderation and restraint, succumbed to that. First, to the insatiable kleptocracy, then to the lethal incompetence of the kludgeocracy, and I'll explain that later if you want to know what that is, and finally to the arbitrary, punitive managerial elite, otherwise known as the new aristocracy. And this progressive elite is a credentialed, molded, opinionated, and uniform class which now presides over the federal and state bureaucracies, the media, the educational establishment, major corporations, and the military. And the way that we've encountered this is called political correctness. It's gone a little beyond that now, but that's how it started, right? Political correctness. And we thought it was about politeness and good manners. But it was never about that. And it was never about being compassionate and inclusive. The point of political correctness, as well as cautions about misgendering and using the proper pronouns, is to force people to ignore the gap between political correctness and reality, to sing the party's tune or shut up. Rosard Leguto insists there is a demon in democracy because he sees a strong family resemblance between communist activists on the one hand and social justice warriors on the other. He notes both sides share their dislike, sometimes bordering on hatred, toward the same enemies: the church and religion, the nation, classical metaphysics, the family moral conservatism. Angelo Codevilla suggests there's a family resemblance for the usual reason. It is the same family. Communism is merely one form of progressivism, and wokeism is simply progressivism's latest iteration. Envy is the permanent flaw in human nature, resentment, the class action among the emotions, and the desire for revenge is all the more dangerous because it depicts itself in the grandest colors. It claims to be about justice and fairness when it is really about revenge and power. In other words, the coercive utopia and the permissive cornucopia are mirror images. The brooding benevolence of the permissive cornucopia is only permissive to its favored victims. On those inclined to resist its coercive call to compassion, it will not hesitate to use the whip, to scourge with fire and sword, or its modern equivalent, the IRS. So undiluted Marxism was too blunt an instrument for most liberal democracies, and the predicted workers' revolt, most of them never materialized. But Antonio Gramsci's concept of cultural hegemony offered a brilliant solution. What he proposed was subversion and seduction. He said, not revolution, but evolution. And the progressive left's adroit manipulation of cultural hegemony has given them a virtual monopoly of America's strong points. They won the culture war long ago, but I don't think they have won the hearts and minds of all the people. And oversight they mean to correct with brute force. What we have been going through is largely not a culture war, but a class war, thinly disguised. And Middle America has been the target of that war because it has come to symbolize everything that stood in the way of progress. Family values, mindless patriotism, religious fundamentalism, racism, homophobia, retrograde views of women. And yet, even though the middle class in flyover country is accused of being the deplorables, they are not the ones who are imposing their views on everyone else. It is actually the new religion of social justice, or wokeism, or moral environmental purity that insists on orthodoxy and dogma. It is their beliefs that are impervious to rational discussion. The poison of subjectivism dictates that protest is the distinctive moral feature of the modern age, and indignation the predominant modern emotion. It's worth noting that this stifling new religion demands not only punitive zeal, but also dogmatic self-righteousness. The narrow intolerance that characterizes this virulent iteration of identity politics is the antithesis of the transformative community ethos that possessed the souls of folks stirred by the religious revivals that swept across the American colonies. In fact, this has completely changed the constitutional presumption. We used to be a country in which ideas controlled violence. We are now a country in which violence controls ideas. Professor Joshua Mitchell says that the Christian notion of radical equality is being supplanted by a strange sort of anti-egalitarian spiritual eugenics, which require pure and innocent groups to ascend while the stained transgressor groups must be purged. However creatively it may be analogized, it is a vile, destructive, mean-spirited orthodoxy. Alas, says Mitchell, the demand for scapegoats is insatiable. Identity politics eventually comes for everyone. And the bitterest irony is that the vast majority of Black Americans whose moral authority has been appropriated to extend the template fashioned by the wound of slavery to women, people of color, and those gathered under the heading of LGBTQ, end up being heteronormative or cisgender offenders in a purification ritual that is perpetually searching for new victims to invoke and new scapegoats to sacrifice. Cardavilla offers a slightly different explanation. He says the point of the exercise has now become not just crushing cultural resistance, but actually forcing people to affirm things they know are not true and to deny others they know to be true, to live by lies, and this requires breaking them, reducing them to a sense of fearful isolation, destroying their self-esteem and their capacity to trust others. Moreover, the imposition of political correctness has no logical end because feeling better about oneself by confessing other people's sins, humiliating them, is an addictive pleasure, the appetite for which grows with each satisfaction. And wokeism is being aggressively exported. Robert Cardinal Sarah has expressed dismay at the way the international organizations are trying to impose by any means the deconstructive theory that differences between men and women are nothing but oppressive norms. To say that human sexuality no longer depends on the identity of a man or a woman, but rather on sexual orientation, he says, is a nightmarish totalitarianism. He concludes, the battle to preserve the roots of mankind is perhaps the greatest challenge the world has faced since its origins. More recently, the World Health Organization has published new abortion care guidelines that demand access to taxpayer-funded abortion at any time, for any reason, and prohibits any requirement for consent by parents of a pregnant minor or the father of the child. At the wholesale level, this is a war on civilization, a denial of the attributes our founding documents attributed to human beings. Michael Walsh actually begins his brilliant dissection of the cult of critical theory by invoking Milton's Paradise Lost to make the point that this is an old struggle, one that goes back to the serpent's first attempt to seduce and destroy humankind when he whispered, "You shall be as gods." We have not, so far, done a very good job of countering what is happening. I think we, for a long time, were taken in by what one writer has called wokecraft, which is to say that for a long time they didn't say exactly what they were doing. When they proposed something that sounded innocuous. And when somebody responded to that by saying, but if you do A, C will follow, they would respond, well, nobody's talking about C. And so then in time, the argument would change a little bit, and people would say, but you're doing C. And they would say, no, we're not doing C, but if we were, it would be a good thing, right? And then the argument would change a little bit more, and they would say, okay, we are doing C. It's the right thing to do. What's your problem, right? And so we kind of slipped into this without too much awareness of actually what was happening, and I think that was a very deliberate strategy. They did very well with, subversion and seduction by making everything seem as if it was not that great a change. So the problem, I think, for conservatives in responding to this is how do we really argue on behalf of a society which is described as being without a cultural core, defined only by a fragile political creed, which no one quite believes in anymore. We've had our moments of moral clarity, but they have delayed, not deflected, our ruinous trajectory. And I'm forced to agree with Michael Anton's devastating critique in his Flight 93 election essay, where he says too many conservatives have accepted their role as the Washington generals of American politics, allowed to participate provided they agree to show up and lose. That was certainly the unsubtle message of the last few election cycles. The election of 2020 may prove to be more of a flashpoint than the upheavals that preceded 1776. When Barack Obama was elected and re-elected, conservatives were told elections have consequences. When Trump was elected in 2016, the left clarified, no election is legitimate when they lose. Indeed, no institution is legitimate which does not promote their agenda. So it's not surprising that we find ourselves today in very challenging circumstances. They are perhaps more challenging than they have been in the past, but I suspect less difficult than they will be in the future. The spirit of American liberty has been waning for a long time. That creed, that worldview, that spirit of liberty represented the only anti-utopian tradition to survive in modern times. When Abraham Lincoln warned that we might meanly lose or nobly save the last best hope of earth, it was the American notion of self-government and freedom of which he spoke. I cannot express to you how much it pains me to see the last best hope carelessly shrugged aside. When I said my mission in retirement was to save America, I was only being partly facetious. But the difficulties that we're facing, I think, is a reality conservatives have to confront without flinching. It has happened. It has happened on our watch. And we have to look to those brightly lighted islands like the JWI Institute, to try and discover how we can push back against this. The perhaps hopeful thing, I guess, I take from experiences that I have had with ordinary people. I live in northern Nevada. It is a land of muscular pickup trucks, white panel vans, men with enough facial hair that it gets caught in their shirt buttons. It might seem like a place where you would be likely to hear the theme song from Deliverance. You might be very worried about being there, but actually, what I have found is some of the nicest, most genuine, most neighborly people that you could imagine. And they are cowed, they are confused, but they are not convinced. And I think it's going to be pretty hard, for the Twitter mob, to affect them as they would like to do. And so I take hope from that. I spent last fall in Cornwall, New York, to teach at West Point, and I had never been there before, and I thought, I'm going to New York. That was going to be a crazy place. And that's what I expected. But it turns out I'm only about 45 miles maybe from New York City. So I thought I am in the deep heart of, blue New York. Not the case. Cornwall was a very working class neighborhood. I got to talk to all of my neighbors, and what they said was, what in the world is going on? But they were so sad. They were so sad because they said, everything is falling apart. What's happening is terrible, but what can we do, right? What can we do? And they just felt that they were powerless. That was very interesting to me to see that. So I think there is work to do. I think it's a bleak prospect in some ways, but bleakness is not always bad, right? I think that we have to maybe take a different view of this. T.S. Eliot says, if we take the widest and wisest view of a cause, there is no such thing as a lost cause, because there's no such thing as a gained cause, right? We fight for lost causes because we know that our defeat and dismay may be the preface to our successor's victory, though that victory itself will be temporary. We fight rather to keep something alive than in the expectation that it will triumph, right? So conservatism has always been the defense of the permanent things against the demands of eager ideology. And this is what I was saying earlier about failure, right? Earlier, the father mentioned Thomas More. And so you might think that Thomas More was defeated, but you might think that powerlessness can be the most heroic thing, right? So it's things are not always what they seem. I was trying to think of what I find encouraging, and what I think we have to model is what C.S. Lewis talked about in Norse mythology, the Norse courage, as he says, the old courage, which means that it's a theory of courage that removes all easy hope, right? Knowing that good is obtained at vast expense while evil recuperates at will is not enough to make the hero change sides. Fighting well and bravely only earns the chance to fight again. And if you know the Norse mythology, then you know that Valhalla is just another battle. But the heroes are fighting on the side of the gods, and it's the twilight of the gods. The gods don't actually have enough power to prevail, but that's not a reason not to be on the right side, right? So that's made me think of the movie Lord of the Rings. And Aragorn's statement to his poor beleaguered troops who have to go forth against this array of goblins and all kinds of horrible beings who stretch endlessly across this plain. And he says to them, and this is not in the book, I guess the director made this up, but it's a good summary, I think. He tells his warriors, there may come a day when the courage of men will fail, but it is not this day. And the words are his rallying cry to this thin, exhausted line of men facing the armies of the evil Lord Sauron. And those who battle for the light do go forward against impossible odds again. That brings us to the America of the early 21st century. The light of that city on the hill has noticeably dimmed. The courage of men has failed, but not the courage of all men or all women. The dark wind blowing from the future carries a hint of frost, of finality. But no matter, we have started over before. Knowing entropy is inevitable is no reason to despair. Knowing the battle never ends only means we must redefine winning. So, like the words that Shakespeare puts into Henry IV's mouth at the Battle of Agincourt, we few, We happy few can choose to fly like eagles and continue to commit our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to the Constitution of liberty, helping the longing for freedom to seep into the hearts of men, and so will faith and reason and courage. Thank you.
Let's see. James Wilson said, "We didn't bring forth this government for the sake of inventing new rights, but to secure and enlarge those rights we already had by nature." And he would point out Blackstone saying, when we came into this government, we gave up all those rights we had in the state of nature, including our liberty to do mischief, and we exchanged them for more constricted set of rights, made more secure by government that would enforce them. To which Wilson said, when did you ever have a liberty to do mischief? When did you ever have a right to do wrong? So those laws that restrained you from raping and murdering are not restraining you from anything you ever had a freedom to do. So he said, we didn't enter this government by giving up the corpus of our natural rights, which made the Federalists say, then what is the meaning of attaching this codicil called the Bill of Rights, marking off those rights we've given up, and we didn't think we gave up any rights here. But let me take it to the, I think there was something I wanted to ask you about. There's something connecting the problem of protecting Supreme Court justices outside their homes and the thuggery that was drawing your attention in the schools. But you touched something else that was very disturbing to me, and that David Crawford said the problem of the transgenderism is that it's a new metaphysic. What is a youngster to think when he's told that his father may be a woman, his mother may be a man, his sister may be a boy? What is he supposed to think now that his own gender is in question? He has to rethink about his own standing. As David said, this is the abolition of man. But you touched me in this another way, so forgive me for going on this, because my late wife Judy said, I thought the experiment Lincoln talked about was ending in a disaster. And I used to tell John O'Sullivan, look, it's getting bad. Keep an eye out for an apartment for me in Budapest. But then I got the shock yesterday. My younger son, who'd been teaching economics at the Naval Postgraduate School, said he wanted to apply for citizenship in Austria because his grandparents fled there in 1938, leaving the under Eichmann. I was thinking of going somewhere else. I said, you know, your grandparents had the wit to flee. My grandparents had the wit and the nerve to flee before Europe turned into a killing field. And the problem is, with all my aversion to what's going on, the problem is people died for this. Mm-hmm. And people died in the Second World War so that I could be here. And at a certain point, I don't think I can walk away from that, you know? It's just disloyal. But let me shift it back. We have a little time to that, what the thuggery going on in the, there's something similar here. People take that as a civil protest to be outside spitting out epithets to somebody coming into the hall. Mm-hmm. I had my own experience at Stanford several years ago. And here's a group a hostile crowd standing outside the home of the Supreme Court justices. Now, a truck driver can tell the difference between a crowd welcoming the Red Sox home after World Series and the crowd that is menacing. Mm-hmm. And we understand traditionally that assault does not require laying on of hands. You could hold an unloaded government to someone's head and click it, so that speech assaults could be forms of assault. Would you consider what's going on in front of the Supreme Court houses now, the justices of the Supreme Court, as a kind of assault that the law could restrain?
Well, I think it's worse than that. What they're doing is actually against the law, whether they're, even if their conduct was not assaultive, their intent is to intimidate and to try and, make these judges who are part of, a branch of government and who are protected by statute from this kind of intimidation.
Right.
Their reason for being there is, unlawful. They're celebrating what they're doing. They're not there to make them feel good. They're there to make them feel under pressure and feel that, if they make decisions that certain people don't like, this will be their life forever. I mean, consider that since Hobbes, this has been going on, and they have had to have extra security.
Sure.
Their lives have not
Sure.
been normal in any way. And this is simply flatly unlawful. And so the Biden administration could have stopped this from the very beginning. All they had to say was, this is unlawful. People who do this will be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, and we mean it. And I think that would have been the end of it.
So we have one law not being enforced. We have a move in Florida to make it unlawful to make demonstrations outside of the homes of judges. So on. So even if this weren't on the books,
Well,
you would still judge this to be something that
Right.
does not cease to be an assault because it's intended by words or
yeah,
this.
no, I mean, I think that's clear. I mean, the whole point of the life tenure for federal judges, the whole idea in the Constitution was to insulate them as much as possible, right, from the public and, what the public might want to, how they might react to what they would do. That was supposed to be the reason for them. They're not political actors, or at least they're not supposed to be. And so this idea that we just, if we don't like what they do, there are ways to respond to that and to make your ideas known. When Roe was decided, and thereafter, for almost 50 years, every year on the anniversary of that decision, thousands of people came to Washington. They marched down Constitution Street, right?
Right.
They went up to the Supreme Court. They talked about why they did not think Roe was a good decision. They expressed their views. They turned around, picked up all their trash, and went home. And in other words, they made that point. But this is not what's happening here.
You could tell a menacing crowd.
Yes.
Yeah. All right. So that James Wilson, you mentioned, thought they should mention ex post facto laws in the Constitution. Everybody knows that. And the point is, we weren't putting in the Constitution everything he knew. And so he raised the question, if we have these natural rights, when do they begin? And his answer was, as soon as we begin to be, which is why he says the common law casts its protection over the child from the first stirrings in the womb. And so now, some of our friends say, we can't cite that line in any of our judicial decisions because it's not in the text.
Well, that's true. It's not in the text. And if people are, I suppose if you're a strict textualist. Oh, I'm sorry.
Oh, she can't hear you. You have to use the mic.
Oh.
Here. Get the microphone next to your mouth, please.
Okay, I'm very sorry. I could hear me very clearly, so I thought I was too loud.
She's been fine. She's been fine.
So I didn't want to be, yelling in everybody's ear, so I apologize. Well, that's what we have been talking about in the 10 years of JWI, right? Is can judges, actually think about this and, consider the telos of the Constitution in addition to its text.
Okay.
You're going to get into a lot of
I'm not going to lure you in, huh?
No, you're going to get into a lot of disputes with people who will say, you can't, we can't do what we have complained of others doing, right? Which is making things up because we think we're visionary and we see this as what should happen. So, That's
Do you think that the court, in the Bostock case, Neil Gorsuch could say, it doesn't matter what the text said in 1964, it depends on what sex really is.
Yes.
Can he point it to the objective truth of what sex must mean as the reproductive, the telos of begetting a new? Could he not have done that? Could you have done that?
I'm not going to answer that.
Well, okay, but it's a rich night. And look, Will gave a marvelous talk, and Amity gave a wonderful introduction. Father Truehouse gave a terrific benediction with this. I said of you once what they said in Shakespeare in Love. You were wonderful.
Oh, okay.
And my hunch is that people would rather just have conversations with Janice now and have some dessert. All right? So let's just call it a night and say